Ethan Carter always believed that a home was more than just four walls. It was a sanctuary built on sweat, memories, and the promise of a better tomorrow. A decorated military veteran and now a respected city official, Ethan had poured years of dedication into restoring his quaint suburban residence. Nestled in a quiet cul-de-sac lined with aging maple trees, his property was not only his retreat, but a symbol of hard-fought freedom and personal triumph. Every brushstroke on the weathered siding and each carefully planned renovation held meaning, a testament to his commitment to preserve the dignity of honest work and heritage. On a crisp autumn morning, as the golden sunlight filtered through the branches, Ethan stepped outside to admire the progress on his latest project, a complete overhaul of his front porch and a subtle update to the landscaping. His work was methodical, guided by years of discipline and a passion for detail. Yet even as he admired the fruits of his labor, dark clouds were gathering on the horizon in the form of the neighborhood's self-appointed enforcer, Karen. Karen wasn't like the rest of the community. As the head of the Homeowners Association HOA, she wielded her power like a badge of honor, her every decision backed by a smug belief in her own righteousness. Known to many as the Queen of Conformity, Karen took it upon herself to police every detail of every home within the subdivision. To her, Ethan's personal touches, those uniquely imperfect elements that celebrated individuality, were nothing more than breaches of a rigid code. Their first confrontation came unexpectedly. While Ethan was fine-tuning the angle of his newly installed solar lights, a sharp knock at the door signaled the arrival of Karen. In her perfectly pressed blouse and sensible shoes, she carried an air of entitlement as palpable as the chill in the air. "Ethan," she began, her tone a mix of disdain and self-importance, "I'm here to remind you that your property is in violation of the HOA guidelines. Your modifications, however charming you think they are, disrupt the community aesthetic." Ethan's calm demeanor betrayed only a flicker of irritation. "Karen, I appreciate your concern, but these changes are within the limits of what our city permits, and I've taken every precaution to ensure they're tasteful." His voice was steady, imbued with the authority of someone who had faced far greater challenges. But Karen was not easily dissuaded. "Tasteful? I call it an eyesore," she snapped. "This isn't just about personal style. It's about maintaining order. And if you won't comply, I'm afraid you leave me no choice." With that, she brandished a handwritten final warning notice, a document that Ethan knew was nothing more than a bluff in Karen's meticulous playbook. Their words clashed in the autumn air, setting the stage for a conflict that would soon envelop not just Ethan's property, but the entire community. In that tense moment, the quiet suburban idyll was shattered by the realization that beneath the veneer of neighborly civility lurked a tyrant ready to enforce her own warped version of order. Ethan retreated back into his home, the first seeds of resistance planted in his mind. He knew that his property wasn't just a structure. It was a living embodiment of his hard-earned freedoms. The thought that someone could so cavalierly trample on that symbol filled him with a determination that would soon ignite into full-blown defiance. As he locked his door and peered out through the window, the distant hum of construction machinery mingled with the sharp echo of Karen's parting words. The battle lines had been drawn. In that quiet moment, Ethan realized that his fight was not merely for a renovation permit. It was for the very right to live, create, and cherish the home that represented everything he stood for. And even as the morning light battled the chill of discord, Ethan's resolve only hardened. Karen might have been the self-appointed guardian of HOA decorum, but he was about to show that passion and integrity could never be so easily muzzled. The following day, Ethan awoke to an unwelcome surprise, a stark white envelope taped to his door. Inside lay a fine, a $750 penalty for community light violations and unsanctioned aesthetic disruptions. As he read the document, his mind raced through the legal codes and zoning ordinances he'd studied throughout his career. There was no basis for this fine. It was nothing more than a manufactured excuse designed to intimidate. Stepping outside to confront the issue head-on, Ethan found Karen already waiting on the sidewalk, her arms crossed and a smug smile fixed on her face. "The rules apply to everyone, Ethan. she declared loudly enough for passers-by to hear. If you can't abide by them, perhaps you shouldn't be allowed to change anything about your property. Ethan's gaze was steady, his voice calm yet firm. Karen, I know my rights. I've consulted local codes, and your so-called violation doesn't hold up. This fine is baseless, and I will be contesting it through proper channels. Karen's smile faltered for a brief moment, replaced by a glint of anger. You think you're above the community, don't you? Just because you serve the city doesn't give you a pass to flout our standards. Her tone carried a mix of condescension and fury as she leaned in close. Let me remind you, Ethan, this isn't a suggestion. It's an order. Not one to be bullied. Ethan simply nodded. I'll be filing a formal complaint with the zoning office. In the meantime, I suggest you review the actual guidelines instead of making arbitrary decisions. As if to punctuate her threat, Karen stepped back and announced, Inspectors are on their way. We'll see how you handle this little setback. Before Ethan could respond, a rumble of approaching vehicles confirmed her warning. Within minutes, uniformed inspectors began to appear at his property, clipboards in hand and expressions set in stone. Inside, Ethan hurriedly gathered documentation, receipts, permits, and copies of local ordinances to defend his renovation. The inspectors' questions were pointed and invasive, and each inquiry only underscored the deep-seated overreach of the HOA. It soon became clear that Karen wasn't merely enforcing community guidelines. She was orchestrating a full-scale campaign of harassment. Throughout the ordeal, Ethan remained unflappable. His years in public service had prepared him for bureaucratic battles and political maneuvering. But as he sorted through the mounting paperwork, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a much larger, more insidious plot. Karen's actions were not driven by a genuine desire for community improvement. They were the calculated maneuvers of someone determined to control every aspect of his life. As the day wore on, Ethan submitted his complaint and began planning his counterattack. He reached out to legal experts, citing precedent after precedent that affirmed his right to renovate without arbitrary interference. In a quiet office at the City Hall later that afternoon, he meticulously prepared a dossier that would eventually expose not only his own case, but a pattern of abuse across the entire neighborhood. Meanwhile, Karen continued to patrol the streets like a self-appointed judge and executioner. Every homeowner who dared question the HOA's decisions found themselves on her radar. Her presence was oppressive, and the community soon realized that resistance, no matter how small, could mean drawing her ire. Yet, even as the neighborhood trembled under her authoritarian rule, a small but determined group of residents began to question the legitimacy of her actions. Back at his home, Ethan pored over the documents by the light of his desk lamp. The fine, the unexpected inspections, and Karen's condescending tone all painted a clear picture. The HOA was less about maintaining community standards and more about exerting control over every facet of homeowners' lives. With each piece of evidence, Ethan's resolve strengthened. He knew that if he could expose these abuses, he could not only clear his name, but also liberate his neighbors from the stranglehold of an overzealous board. By the end of the day, as twilight cast long shadows across his now storm-tossed property, Ethan sat back and reflected on the confrontation. The fine was just a spark, and Karen, the one holding the match. Determined not to let her dictate the terms of his life, he vowed that the coming days would mark the beginning of a fight for justice. The battle was on, and Ethan Carter was ready to reclaim his property, his peace, and ultimately, his community's dignity. The script continues with Ethan uncovering hidden irregularities as Karen begins deploying ever more draconian measures, issuing bogus violation notices, hinting at eviction, and even threatening property seizure. Ethan's investigations reveal that complaints against him are not isolated incidents, but part of a deliberate pattern. Rumors swirl among neighbors, whispers of secret donations that make fines vanish and hush up genuine concerns. One evening, during a discreet conversation over a picket fence, an anxious board member confides in Ethan that Karen has been siphoning HOA funds for personal use. Determined to document every injustice, Ethan installs cameras around his property and begins compiling meticulous records of every incident. Each day brings new evidence of the HOA's overreach, from doctored inspection reports to fabricated letters threatening dire consequences if Ethan does not comply. As the tension escalates, Ethan finds himself increasingly isolated by those too intimidated to speak out. Yet, the courage of a few like-minded neighbors only fuels his determination. Late one night, while reviewing hours of surveillance footage, Ethan notices something damning. A clandestine meeting between Karen and a few board members, during which they discussed altering documents and ignoring clear violations by other homeowners. His heart races as he realizes that this isn't just about his property. It's an organized, corrupt effort to control every aspect of life in the subdivision. Armed with these revelations, Ethan begins reaching out to other homeowners. Informal gatherings turn into passionate meetings where frustration and anger mix with hope. The community, long cowed by Karen's authoritarian style, starts to see that their collective voices might be the only way to reclaim their rights. It becomes clear that Karen's unchecked power has eroded trust, and her misdeeds run deeper than anyone had imagined. At the next informal meeting held in the community park, Ethan presents his findings. "Look at this footage," he tells the gathered crowd, projecting grainy video onto a portable screen. "This isn't just about me, it's about all of us. Karen and her cronies have been abusing their power for far too long. We deserve transparency, fairness, and respect in our own homes." The reaction is electric. Neighbors who once kept their heads down now speak up, sharing their own experiences of fines, intimidation, and the mystery of disappearing money from the HOA fund. One resident recalls a fine levied against him for a minor landscaping misstep, while another tearfully describes how the constant harassment has driven him to the brink of despair. The collective outcry forms a chorus of injustice, and for the first time, Ethan sees a path forward. As the meeting winds down, Ethan privately receives an unexpected tip. A board member, fearful of Karen's increasingly erratic behavior, slips him a USB drive containing incriminating emails and financial records. In hushed tones, the defector reveals that Karen's abuse of power is systemic. Her actions have not only enriched her personally, but have been used to silence dissent and control every homeowner's destiny. Determined to leverage this evidence, Ethan begins planning his counterattack. The next few days are a whirlwind of covert meetings, gathering additional documentation, and consulting with legal experts who confirm that the HOA has overstepped its bounds. Every piece of evidence adds weight to his argument. The HOA's actions are not only unethical, they're illegal. With each new discovery, Ethan's resolve hardens. This isn't just a fight for his home. It's a fight for every voice that has been stifled under Karen's reign. Even as Ethan amasses evidence, Karen's tactics become ever more brazen. Anonymous complaints start flooding in about his property, and inspectors are sent again, this time with even less regard for due process. The air in the neighborhood grows thick with tension, and it becomes evident that Karen is resorting to desperation. Her threats now hint at eviction, and even property seizure if Ethan doesn't bend to her will. Yet, despite the pressure, Ethan remains calm. He knows that the truth is on his side, and that the community's growing awareness is a powerful weapon. With a USB drive and a stack of handwritten notes, he prepares to take his battle public. The stage is set for a showdown, a battle that will determine not only the fate of his beloved home, but the future of an entire community oppressed by a tyrannical HOA. As the days passed, Karen's actions grew more extreme. One morning, Ethan woke to find his driveway being excavated, an apparent sidewalk expansion that threatened to sever access to his home. Heavy machinery rumbled in the early hours, and before he could even comprehend what was happening, he received a curt message from the HOA. Comply immediately or face further consequences. Ethan's heart pounded as he rushed outside to find his car precariously positioned near a barricade of caution tape. The once familiar landscape had been transformed into a battleground. At that moment, the line between community improvement and outright tyranny blurred. Karen's latest move wasn't about aesthetics. It was an aggressive assertion of power. Determined not to be cowed, Ethan gathered a file of legal documents, zoning permits, and official correspondence that clearly demonstrated the HOA's lack of authority over his property. With his evidence clutched tightly, he marched to the next scheduled HOA meeting, a gathering that had become infamous for Karen's dictatorial rulings. Inside the community center, tension simmered. Homeowners filled the room, eyes downcast or steely with resolve. Karen, standing at the head of the table, radiated an aura of authority bolstered by the silent threat of fines and legal repercussions. As the meeting commenced, Karen began outlining a litany of supposed violations, from alleged landscaping errors to non-existent zoning infractions. Her voice, normally measured, now trembled with an undercurrent of panic. Before Karen could continue, Ethan stepped forward. "I have something to share," he declared, his voice cutting through the murmurs. With deliberate calm, he laid out the file of documents on the table, a dossier that not only refuted every claim, but also exposed the absurdity of the HOA's overreach. According to our city's codes, none of these so-called violations have any legal standing. In fact, I have the permits to prove it. A hush fell over the room. The evidence was irrefutable. Board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and even some of Karen's staunchest supporters exchanged uneasy glances. For the first time, her iron grip on the community seemed to waver. Karen's face flushed as she stuttered. This isn't how things are done. We have rules for a reason." But Ethan pressed on, unveiling additional documentation that detailed irregularities in the way fines were levied and funds were managed. "It appears," he said slowly, "that certain rules were created solely to benefit a few at the expense of everyone else. This is not about community standards, it's about control." The room buzzed with whispered agreements. One homeowner, emboldened by Ethan's courage, rose and said, "I've been fined for having a garden gnome that didn't match the HOA-approved design. This is ridiculous." Others began recounting their own experiences of arbitrary fines and invasive inspections. The collective discontent was palpable. Karen's protests grew desperate. "You're causing chaos," she shouted, nearly losing her composure. "If you don't comply, you're not only jeopardizing your own property, but undermining the entire community's order." But her words fell flat against the mounting evidence and the quiet fury of the gathered residents. In that pivotal moment, the community's stance shifted. Homeowners began to voice their support for Ethan's right to manage his property as he saw fit. The board members, once complicit in Karen's heavy-handed tactics, started to question the legitimacy of her actions. As murmurs of dissent turned into outright calls for accountability, Karen's authority crumbled before everyone's eyes. Defiantly, Ethan concluded, "Today we stand for our rights, not just mine but all of ours. The HOA's role is to serve and protect our community, not to terrorize us with arbitrary rules." With those words, the tide turned. The meeting ended in a stunned silence that resonated far beyond the walls of the community center. Outside, as neighbors filed out into the cool evening air, a newfound sense of unity and resolve took hold. Ethan's stand had not only exposed the overreach of the HOA, but it also ignited a spark of collective action. Karen, once the undisputed enforcer of conformity, now found herself isolated and outnumbered, a shadow of the dictatorial figure she once was. Cornered and furious at the public rebuke, Karen's tactics reached a new level of desperation. Determined to regain control at any cost, she began planning an audacious move that would shock the entire community. Late one evening, under a sky heavy with foreboding clouds, Karen orchestrated her final power play. Earlier that day, rumors had circulated that Ethan was preparing to release even more damning evidence of HOA misconduct. Incensed by the possibility that her misdeeds would soon be exposed beyond repair, Karen decided that intimidation must take center stage. With a cold resolve that bordered on madness, she reached out to the local police, fabricating a story that Ethan's renovations were causing a public disturbance and endangering the neighborhood. At first light the next morning, the quiet suburb was shattered by the sound of sirens. Neighbors peeked from behind drawn curtains as police cruisers rolled to a stop in front of Ethan's home. Ethan, who had anticipated another day of bureaucratic harassment, was taken aback by the sudden escalation. Before he could gather his thoughts, Karen arrived on the scene, her presence more menacing than ever. Standing on Ethan's porch, Karen's eyes darted around furtively until she locked onto him. "Ethan," she hissed, "if you don't back down right now, I won't hesitate to take this further. I'm not playing around anymore." Her voice was low and dangerous, carrying an edge that sent shivers down the spines of onlookers. Then, in a moment that would be seared into the community's collective memory, Karen reached into her purse and produced a small handgun. The metallic glint of the weapon under the early sun was both surreal and horrifying. "You think you can defy the rules and get away with it?" she spat, her hand trembling with barely contained fury as she brandished the gun. "I will do whatever it takes to make you comply." For a long, agonizing moment, time seemed to freeze. The gathered crowd gasped, and even the officers, momentarily stunned by the scene, instinctively stepped back. Ethan, despite the shock coursing through him, maintained a measured calm. His mind raced. This was no longer a bureaucratic dispute, but a direct threat to his life and the safety of his community. "Karen, put the gun down," Ethan said steadily, his voice unwavering despite the peril. "This isn't the way to solve our differences." In that charged silence, every eye in the neighborhood bore witness to a confrontation that went far beyond petty fines and inspections. Karen's eyes flickered with a mixture of rage and desperation as she continued, "I'm tired of being disrespected. I'm tired of watching you trample over the rules we all agreed to follow." But even as she ranted, Ethan's security camera, positioned strategically after his earlier discoveries, continued to record every detail. Unbeknownst to Karen, this would be the evidence that would ultimately seal her fate. The officers, regaining their composure, attempted to defuse the situation. "Ma'am, please lower the weapon," one of them urged, his tone firm but measured. Karen's grip faltered for a split second, enough for Ethan to step forward and gently but firmly insist that she surrender the gun. In that heart-stopping moment, the raw intensity of the encounter was palpable. Neighbors whispered among themselves, some reaching for their phones to capture the historic moment, while others simply watched in silent disbelief. Realizing that her plan was unraveling, Karen's voice cracked as she muttered, "You have no idea what you've done." The threat in her tone was now mixed with panic. But the damage was done. The footage captured that day of a self-styled enforcer resorting to arms would soon be broadcast widely, exposing her true character to everyone she had tried so desperately to control. As the police took Karen into custody for disorderly conduct and for brandishing a weapon, Ethan remained composed. The confrontation, harrowing as it was, had galvanized the community further. Ethan's measured response under duress not only underscored the righteousness of his cause, but also paved the way for the community's collective demand for justice. Later that day, as news of the incident spread, Ethan reviewed the recorded footage. Every frame was a testament to the corruption and desperation that had infected the HOA leadership. Karen's final, desperate move had become the turning point, a vivid, undeniable moment of reckoning that would tip the scales in favor of truth and justice. The fallout from Karen's drastic stunt was immediate and explosive. By afternoon, the neighborhood was abuzz with the details of her arrest. Social media exploded with shared footage and impassioned commentary, and what had once been an isolated dispute had become a rallying cry for everyone who had suffered under the oppressive rule of the HOA. At the next emergency HOA meeting, now held in a local community hall rather than the outdated, intimidating boardroom, homeowners gathered in droves. The atmosphere was charged with righteous indignation. Ethan, armed with a well-organized dossier of evidence, including the now-viral video of Karen brandishing a gun, stood before the crowd as a beacon of truth. "This is the moment we've all been waiting for," Ethan announced, his voice resonant and steady. "Today we reclaim our neighborhood." The room erupted in applause and shouts of agreement. Homeowners recounted their own experiences of arbitrary fines, invasive inspections, and the myriad injustices meted out by Karen and her cronies. Under mounting pressure, even the most loyal board members began to waver. During a tense vote that afternoon, a majority of the members, once complicit in Karen's regime, voted unanimously to remove her from office. The decision was swift and decisive. Karen's power, which she had wielded with such ruthless arrogance, evaporated in the face of overwhelming community outrage. In the weeks that followed, the HOA was subjected to a full-scale investigation. State officials and local authorities scrutinized every transaction, every notice, and every piece of evidence Ethan and his supporters had gathered. The inquiry revealed not only Karen's flagrant abuse of power, but also a series of systemic irregularities in the HOA's operations. Homeowners learned that fines were levied without proper authority, inspections were conducted on a whim, and funds had been diverted for personal gain. The community, now united by a common purpose, rallied behind Ethan. Neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak up now attended public hearings, shared their own stories, and even contributed additional evidence that further dismantled the fraudulent practices of the HOA. The very institution that had once imposed a reign of terror was crumbling under the weight of its own corruption. By the time the dust finally settled, Karen's reputation was in tatters. Not only had she been removed from her position, but legal actions were also launched against the entire board for their complicity in her unethical practices. The once feared HOA now faced fines, lawsuits, and a mandate to reform its operations entirely. As the community celebrated its newfound freedom, Ethan quietly sipped his coffee on the porch he had fought so hard to preserve. The quiet satisfaction in his eyes was mirrored in the faces of his neighbors, each one a living testament to the power of collective action and the triumph of integrity over tyranny. In the weeks following Karen's dramatic arrest and the subsequent public outcry, the full legal ramifications for the HOA began to materialize. An investigation spearheaded by the city's legal department uncovered a trail of misconduct that went far beyond isolated incidents of bullying. The board was found to have systematically violated local ordinances and misappropriated funds, rendering their actions not only unethical but illegal. Ethan, now recognized as the community's de facto leader, worked closely with several attorneys to file a class action lawsuit against the HOA. Homeowners united, pulling together every shred of evidence, from Karen's videotaped outburst to the irregular financial records that painted a damning picture of corruption. The lawsuit cited violations of municipal codes, fraud, and harassment, and soon, the community's legal victory began to take shape. City officials imposed hefty fines on the HOA, and criminal charges were considered for those most directly involved in the wrongdoing. In a final act of defiance against the tyranny of unchecked power, Ethan's legal team secured a court order that dissolved the existing board, mandating a comprehensive restructuring that would return decision-making power to the homeowners. For Ethan, this was more than just a legal win. It was a message that no individual, no matter how entitled or self-important, could trample on the rights of an entire community without facing consequences. His final power move, delivered with calm determination and backed by irrefutable evidence, set a precedent for communities across the region. As the legal storm raged around the HOA, Karen's personal life began to unravel in parallel. Once celebrated as the steadfast enforcer of community standards, she now found herself the subject of scorn and ridicule. The local newspapers ran headline after headline documenting her erratic behavior, and social media became awash with memes and commentary about the gun-toting HOA queen. At home, the consequences were just as severe. Neighbors who had once exchanged polite greetings now openly avoided her. Her longtime friends distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with someone whose actions had brought such disgrace upon the community. In a twist of bitter irony, Karen's husband, who had once supported her ambitions, filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences and the toxic atmosphere she had fostered. Financial ruin soon followed. The court-mandated fines and legal fees drained her resources, and her prized residence, a lavish, overly ornate home that she had maintained as a symbol of her authority, was forced onto the market. Public humiliation reached its peak when Karen was seen arguing with city officials at a routine meeting, desperately trying to salvage what little dignity she had left. In the midst of her personal collapse, Ethan caught a final glimpse of poetic justice. At a local community event meant to celebrate the newfound freedom of the neighborhood, he spotted Karen attempting to seek employment as an assistant property manager for another HOA. With a wry smile and a quiet word of triumph, he approached her. "I hope you enjoy following the rules this time," he said softly, leaving no doubt that karma had finally caught up with her. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood began to heal from the long, painful ordeal. Life slowly returned to a state of peaceful normalcy, but the scars of tyranny served as a lasting reminder of the power of community unity. Ethan Carter's home, once a battleground for a corrupt HOA, now shone as a symbol of perseverance, justice, and the triumph of the individual spirit. On a sunlit afternoon, as neighbors strolled past freshly painted fences and newly planted gardens, Ethan sat on his porch, quietly savoring a hard-won victory. The once oppressive presence of the HOA had been replaced by a spirit of collaboration and mutual respect. Homeowners gathered for weekend barbecues and impromptu block parties, each conversation a subtle reminder of the dark days they had overcome. In a final, almost humorous twist of fate, as Ethan relaxed with his morning coffee, a neighbor strolled by with a mischievous grin, holding an official-looking HOA notice. "We've got a new violation for you," the neighbor joked, handing over a laminated sheet citing a completely absurd infraction, something as trivial as excessive porch decor enthusiasm. Ethan chuckled and shook his head. "Some things never change," he replied, his tone light yet resolute. That day, as laughter and friendly banter filled the air, the community collectively recognized that they had reclaimed not only their rights, but their dignity. The dark chapter of Karen's reign was finally closed, replaced by a future built on transparency, fairness, and neighborly trust. With the final act of the drama now behind them, Ethan Carter's story became a testament to the enduring power of truth and unity. The mic had indeed dropped, loud and clear, for all who would dare to challenge the spirit of a community that refuses to be cowed by tyranny.